All right, thank you for joining us this morning. The topic for this webinar, the second in our series on trade in Africa, but then we all got the surprise of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I've had a number of clients ask if we could take a little bit of time to touch on this fairly grim topic so we can understand from a South African and from an African perspective, what, if anything, are the implications of this terrible conflict halfway around the world. My name is Donald Mackay. For those who don't know me, I'm the founder and a director of EXA International Trade Advisors. Today, I'm joined by, with Dr. Judy Smith-Hearn, who is a director at Tutwa Consulting Group. And we'll both be climbing in, giving you some facts. Then we're going to have a bit of a conversation with each other and we'll open up for questions. I'd like to propose, if you have any questions, that you type them in the box and Pumalelo will coordinate the answering of the questions at the end. And if you want to ask a question and not type it up, then raise your hand and we'll be sure to attend to it. All right, let's get started. On the 24th of February, Russia invades Ukraine. Running up to this, we'd seen troops clustering around the border, but I'm not sure that anyone, I'm not entirely sure that anyone wasn't shocked at the moment when this invasion happened. Data at the moment is fairly light. It's still fairly early in this process. We hope that this war ends fairly soon. But we're going to talk through what we can see at the moment, give our best estimates of how we read the situation, and take your views. And I am struggling to get my... So let's start with just how much trade we do respectively with Russia and Ukraine. And it's less than 1% in both directions for both countries. These are very, very small trading partners. Don't be deceived by the idea that South Africa joins with Russia, India, China, and Brazil to form BRICS. There is very, very little trade between these countries. However, that doesn't mean the impact is negligible, although directly, this kind of trade is probably not something directly that we should be sweating too much over. Of far greater concern are what the indirect impacts are starting to look like. So let's take a moment to get a sense of how much trade we do with these two regions. So this is on the left-hand side, our imports from Russia and Ukraine, Russia in the red block and Ukraine in the orange, and our exports. And you can see we export marginally more than what we import. However, the indirect impacts are immediate, long-term, and significant. And Judy is going to take a little bit of time to talk about things like the fuel and the food impacts. I'm not going to spend too much time onto that, but already everyone would have seen the fuel price go up at the pump. We look at items like wheat, and the wheat price has spiked fairly significantly. There are shortages. So if you're a bakery, if you're manufacturing pasta, any of these items that contain a large portion of wheat, then certainly you are going to be feeling some of that impact. But it's not just direct impact. So as the cereals and oil seeds increase in price, they also drive up the cost of animal protein. In the period leading up to the war, so before the war had broken out, we'd seen a 17% price in chicken. So without accounting for the impact of this, from the beginning of 2021 to the beginning of 2022, there was a 17% price increase in chicken. This is, give or take, 3.5 times the average inflation rate for that period. So very, very significant price increase. And we see that food is inflating at a far faster rate than the average price. And this conflict, despite the fact, again, that we are not, for example, buying chickens out of Ukraine, will have an effect. Now, interestingly, the second largest supplier of boneless chicken into the EU. The EU consumes in the order of around 900,000 tons of chicken breast a year is Ukraine. With the interruption to that supply chain, it's unfortunate that South Africa has done so little to position itself well to get our chicken into Europe. But certainly, despite the fact that the circumstances around it are fairly grim, the fact is that market has certainly become more appealing and more attractive. Of course, South Africa hasn't gone through the process of getting approved to export our chickens into the EU. And so that opportunity will be lost. It will be taken up by somebody else, but it is not going to be South Africa, unlikely to be anywhere else out of Africa. And this at a time, by the way, when boneless chicken breast is hitting an all-time high. I'm in Europe at the moment, and I'm absolutely astonished at how the price of chicken has risen. So certainly the implications are being felt in Europe immediately, and like I said, an opportunity if we were in a position to actually trade into Europe. I think capital is going to move, and fairly dramatically. We see some of this happening already. If we look at the amount of money that the West, particularly the US, but certainly not just the US, has either spent on defense spending for the Ukraine or aid, which is just going to become a larger and larger amount of money. But not only to Ukraine, as refugees move predominantly into Eastern Europe, countries like Poland, Romania, funding is going to be required to support these refugees. We've seen Germany approve an extra 100 billion euros in their defense spending. That's just a little bit over 3 times what they were spending beforehand. But all of this has, again, implications for Africa, where extra money is being concentrated in Ukraine. That money has to come from somewhere, and at least a portion of it will likely flow out of funds that currently go into Africa. It's of course unfortunate that the spending is happening in this way. It would be far more appealing if the investment into Ukraine was for productive build, putting up factories or hospitals or whatever else it might be, not to rebuild what was there beforehand. So not a very productive use of capital. That doesn't make it any less essential. But I do believe the diversion of capital to Ukraine will be large enough that we will feel it as far away as Africa and other countries, which would typically have benefited from the largesse of funders who will now be diverting that capital into Ukraine and Eastern Europe. All of this comes, of course, right after COVID. So how much money is available is also debatable. A lot at the moment appears to be flowing, but how long can that keep flowing? We've come out of COVID, huge amounts of debt were incurred in that period. So that's certainly an area we're not clear on. But something we are watching is what happens to that money. In fact, let me go back to that. Also, do we begin seeing increases in interest rates in other countries in order to draw capital into those regions? So if we're seeing money moving to Eastern Europe, into Ukraine, how do you bring that money back? And a part of it might be higher interest rates. So certainly all of this is telling a story of worryingly increased inflation, no doubt. What happens to Europe with dramatically increased energy prices? I have no idea. We know that the Germans have lots of political reasons why they're disinclined to turn on their nuclear power plants. But if anything, this has probably put a true fire under the efforts to create renewable energy at scale. I'm not sure anyone wants to be in the position that Europe finds itself at the moment, and Germany most of all, of this utter dependence on a single supplier who turns out to be rather belligerent. And I do think this will serve to drive up investment in healthier energy options to the coal and the gas. And that's an interesting transition. Once that occurs, it's unlikely to ever go back again. If that happens, this this might be a terrible way to drive forward the climate change agenda, but I think it certainly makes sense to me that we will be seeing more of these sorts of investments, which will drive the same kind of investments elsewhere. So if nothing else, that might be some impetus for alternative energy, environmentally friendly energy investment. There's an interesting project at the moment that's happening between Namibia and Europe, looking at the export of hydrogen, which has been harvested from solar farms and then sent over to Europe. So I'm not sure where exactly in the process that is, but these sorts of initiatives, I would guess, would become more and more appealing, depending how long this goes on for. And as much as we hope it ends soon, there's no end in sight right now that I can tell. So this presumably does still go on for a bit. What happens when the next crops are not planted in Ukraine? We have portions of the world, this has been all over the media, that are considerably more dependent on grains coming out of Russia and Ukraine. So there's the short-term problem, and we have seen some reactions to that in the form of export controls from other countries, as they fear that the supply shortage will drive up their prices. But that comes with problems. So in other words, is the shortage we see now really just the start of the problem? What happens when that shortage increases because the next season's grains are not being planted? And so that certainly paints a grim picture. If we look at South Africa, for example, we import around 50% of our wheat. No matter what government has done to fiddle with the duty rates on wheat, we never really move beyond the 50% threshold. If wheat becomes expensive enough, that may very well be the case, and maybe we will put down more wheat. But it does talk to finding alternative suppliers and possibly spreading out that supply chain risk a little bit. We are still very dependent on these two. So for companies that are producing pasta and wheat, I would assume they are sweating right now around where they'd be getting the raw material to make bread, etc. The risk of export controls being imposed by grain-producing countries particularly increases. Hungary has already put export controls in place to try to regulate the price of grain within Hungary. But this doesn't always work well. We had a similar situation arise with rice in India a number of years ago. In that case, there wasn't a very good harvest. India put export controls on the rice. This depreciated the price of the rice, but also made some of the farms not feasible. And the farmers are then faced with taking the hit on the losses on their crops. So the export controls could in fact exacerbate the problem. And there's every indication that other countries are also looking at export controls. This creates a real dilemma for the countries that cannot produce wheat. So every time another country cuts off its supply of wheat from the global pool, the price of wheat is going to increase more significantly. And many of the countries that are dependent on wheat, many of them in Northern Africa, for example, will find themselves with dramatically increased wheat prices. Countries that impose the export controls might very well find collapsing prices, which is ironic. So that market mechanism, which normally balances those out, will stop functioning properly. And I am quite concerned. I do think we are going to see more of this as the war continues with, I think, quite worrying conditions globally. It appears, irrespective of what happens with the conflict at the moment, that Russia loses. I see no scenario where Russia comes out of this as a victor in any normal sense of the word. It feels at this point that even if the war were to end tomorrow, it's going to be very hard to reintegrate Russia back into the world economy. They've been removed abruptly and fairly aggressively. How do they reintegrate? So do we find a possibility that we have yet another Iron Curtain, this time divided a little bit differently to what we had last time, but with quite frightening consequences? So we could end up with a world divided into two, and I've called the one grouping the Democrats and the other grouping the autocrats, and not entirely sure where Africa fits into all of that. Africa has been trying to put forward a neutral face, but I'm not sure the declarations of neutrality are working terribly well. And so we have, on the democratic side of this, most of Western Europe, the US, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and hopefully at the end of this, Ukraine. We have the autocrats, which are a strange group of countries. Russia, Belarus, I put China there, but I don't honestly know, because China's dependency on trade with the West, particularly the US and Europe, is just so significant that I'm truly not sure where China falls in reality, no matter what noises they make. India will no doubt, especially under the presidency of Modi, is likely to stay in the autocrat club. They benefit at the moment with weapons out of Russia. They benefit with cheap oil as Russia discounts its oil prices to India. But these are two very different bodies. The right-hand body are armed to the teeth, and if you exclude China, are not terribly economically influential. The West becoming increasingly well-armed. So we could find ourselves, broadly speaking, with almost two big trade blocs, where with the democratic trade bloc, you apply the WTO rules, you have a most favored nation status for countries, but with the autocrats trading with themselves, they would behave in much the same way. But trading between those blocks is likely to see increased amounts of barriers. And I think the least barrier there would be the duties. But if we look at what's happened with the weaponization of the SWIFT payment system, that's had an impact out of all proportion to anything that could be done with duties. So when the war ends, which of course it has to end, depending how it ends, it feels to me like we are looking at some kind of separation, which is not good for either side, but seems in some ways inevitable. I think it's going to take a while for Russia, Belarus, etc., to find themselves back in to the global trading system as we would know it. Does the blocking of Russia from the world economy drive them closer to China? I think it does. However, not that close. We should have no illusions here that China and Russia are equal partners. China is definitely the senior partner. And I think Africa will take its cue more from how China behaves than by what Russia is doing. China is simply more significant. I think China will have more influence on how Africa deals with everything that's happening than the West will have. So despite the fact that Europe and the US do their best to have an influence on Africa, I think the influence of China is outsized. And if China appears to take actions which are supportive of Russia, I think Africa will lean more in that direction. But I think that's difficult for China. China has a very strong trading relationship with the West, something I am not sure that they would want to forfeit for Russia, where the amount of trade between China and Russia, although not trivial, is by no means comparable to their trade with the West. And I'm pretty sure China does not want to sit and find themselves on the wrong side of the sanctions that are being imposed. So we shall have to see, I guess, what happens there. But I think Africa will take its lead from what China does. As mentioned, I do think Russia and India will draw ever closer. India simply has a really good mercantilist reason for this: cheaper oil, and they are buying more and more weapons from China, and that is convenient right now. And I think that will continue going forward, at least while we have the current politicians in place. I'm curious because perhaps the most outspoken thing South Africa has done is to declare with I think a very quiet voice that we are neutral, but then be a lot more vocal of the support for Russia. And whilst I think it's unlikely anybody from the EU or from the US is going to come out and just outright condemn South Africa's stance or threaten to cut off a trade agreement or any such thing. I do think this will have long-term implications. We are looking at 2025 when AGOA comes to an end. If AGOA is renewed, I think it's increasingly unlikely that South Africa is going to be a beneficiary. Given that South Africa has steadfastly refused to enter into a trade agreement with the US, I think this might be one of those things that pushes that relationship over the edge and causes South Africa to lose its preferential access to the US, which is bad, but not as bad as it sounds on first brush. A fairly large portion of our trade with the US does not benefit from AGOA, but for those sectors that do benefit, the implications are going to be very serious indeed. And in fact, the topic of our next webinar is going to be exactly this, because when we look at the data, we look at the behavior, increasingly it's looking like South Africa will not benefit from AGOA going forward. And so how does South Africa look in a post-AGOA world, particularly if the rest of Africa retains its benefits? And if AGOA does continue, where does that leave South Africa? And that's very interesting. I don't have an answer immediately, but in the longer term, I think we are burning some bridges. And I'm not sure strategically we're thinking through carefully enough what align ourselves with Russia is doing, a trading partner, as I pointed out, who accounts for less than 1% of our trade. If you compare that to the EU, for example, which accounts for 20% of our trade, but where we only account for around half a percent of the EU's imports. So those imbalances make for, I think, an interesting period over the next few years. And we will have to see how our trading partners treat this position. So what do we see as a summary? I think food and fuel inflation are going to continue. I think food is going to keep inflating at above the average inflation rate for the foreseeable future. I think interest rates are going to keep rising, and that may even happen more aggressively as we need to find ourselves attracting capital here. I do think there will be a reorganization of the global alliances. And my apologies, the last bullet point is incorrect. Increased economic tension between Western Europe, the USA, and what I meant to say was the Eastern Bloc, the bloc of the autocrats, if you like. So what happens with those increased tensions going forward? And on that note, I am going to hand over to Judy. I see there are some questions and some hands up. We'll get to those as soon as Judy has completed. And I think you need to take over, Judy.
Thanks, Donald. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Donald, for inviting me to join you on this. I think a lot of what I also want to say, I think we agree on many issues, and as you mentioned, I think I'll be able to touch on some of the questions even that have been posed in the chat. Now, I think for me, the war in Ukraine and the impact on Africa is summed up really easily in 3 words. Here comes uncertainty. We really are facing an unprecedented time. It couldn't come at a worse time, basically. And I think the next couple of slides I'll just take through, and perhaps also, reaffirm some of the things that you, Donald, have already mentioned as well. Sorry, there we go. So I want to touch on 3 areas, and I want to look at sort of the direct impact on trade. Some of those things that you mentioned already. There are some numbers there as well, which will probably also answer some of those questions. Those 3 Fs: the impact on food, fertilizer, and fuel. And then, of course, together with that comes the impact on food insecurity and political stability. And then, of course, the issue that you've mentioned at length already, how this will reshape the global order going forward. Now, turning to the first F, food, we know that Ukraine and Russia are agricultural powerhouses. As you'd mentioned before, they represent 53% of global trade in things like sunflower oil, nearly a third in wheat. 25 African countries import more than a third of the wheat from both of these countries. And the impact really is those incredible rises in food prices at 34% higher than it was this time last year. And of course, in countries where poorer developing countries that spend significant portions of their incomes on food, this is clearly going to have a significant impact on undernourishment and food insecurity. Turning then, of course, also to fertilizer, which you touched on very briefly. Russia and Belarus export 1/5 of the world's fertilizers. And of course, for food producers and as many small farmers we have on the continent, if they can't access fertilizers and agricultural inputs, this of course further increases the likelihood that there will be significant market disturbances, which will feel right the way through to next year. And as you'd mentioned also, the closing up of borders. I mean, if countries decide to close their food markets, it will obviously set off a domino effect on trade restrictions and export bans. Turning then to the third F, we know Russia is the world's top natural gas exporter. It's the 2nd largest oil exporter. Crude oil prices have increased. I mean, they were already at an increase. They've increased around 60%. And oil being this universal intermediary good, that'll obviously influence the cost of commodities, of services, and transport costs. And I mean, I know you had said, countries like Germany, the European Union, they might sort of turn more towards alternative sources of energy as they want to strengthen their energy resilience. But I do think the jury might still be out for certain countries that might actually turn more towards coal to ramp up their production, particularly if, there's a cornering of the markets on gas, or the international market on gas from the EU. It might encourage other countries to move back to coal in the short to medium term. So I think the jury might still be out on that. There are also other Fs. I think, there's the finance shocks and the freight costs, financial shocks. I mean, the cost of debt servicing, as you've mentioned these as well. Developing countries are spending an average of 16% on the export earnings on servicing their debt. Rising bond yields have really increased already. And this is likely since the start of the conflict. Net food importers have registered an above average increase in borrowing costs as well. And of course, those freight costs, the disruptions to global logistics and supply chains have increased freight costs, and the delays across those global maritime transport systems. Of course, with China now also going into lockdown once more, that further puts pressure on the entire global system. Trade restrictions, airspace closures, contractor uncertainties, and all of those security concerns further impact those freight costs. This is the slide on the right. I thought was quite useful just to show in terms of the impact particularly on specific economies. 25 economies on the continent are severely significantly exposed to all 3 of these shocks, to food, energy, and finance shocks. So any one of these changes would have a huge impact on 25 economies on the continent. You'll see the numbers there of people already living in poverty, the number of people who are already undernourished. If you take it a little bit, there's another graph that perhaps looks a little bit more worrying. You have 40 economies in Africa who are affected severely or significantly exposed to at least one of these. So that's also another figure we could maybe look at as well, which obviously plays a huge role. Going back to the issue of food insecurity and social unrest, there has been historical evidence to show that food price spikes have led to political unrest. The Arab Spring, for example, was one example, as you can see on the graph here. Because food accounts for a larger portion of household spending, socioeconomic stress due to the pandemic has even worsened all of that. So I think this is really something that we need to keep in mind, and it's particularly relevant for the continent, certainly. And then, of course, as you had mentioned at length, the extent to which, and I think this is really an important one, and this is where the uncertainty comes in, is the extent to which this has reshaped the global order. People speak of a deglobalization, a renewed competition between the great powers, and here I agree with you. The great powers are not the US and Russia, but it's the US and the Eastern Bloc, potentially led by China. And I think for me, this question, this topic raises questions more than anything else because it's so uncertain. There are lots of questions. Obviously, many have asked, why did Africa not support the West? There's that committed non-alignment. That's the fear of upsetting China, as you'd already also touched upon, the reliance on Russia for arms and security. I do also think there's a bit of resentment on on the part of some countries towards military interventions that have been initiated before. I think Libya is particularly close to home if you consider the approach by NATO at the time and the counter approach that the AU had actually wanted to follow at the time. And then, of course, that's the question that you said, what is the impact of this neutral positioning on the future of bilateral relations and development aid? Development aid, not only because of, and certainly that's further exacerbated by the fact, as you had mentioned, that as countries are spending more on their security and on their military spend, they are going to have to take that money from elsewhere, and they're also bringing their development aid closer to home, in a way. And then, of course, that is going to have to come from somewhere, and it's very likely to come from the continent, at least, as you said, a portion of it. I think the biggest thing really, we need to stay connected, because being connected matters, and it matters particularly for African countries, as we can't, we have to be part of a value chain. And as these value chains become less and less global, that's certainly going to have an impact on our potential for growth going forward. I will stop at that for now, Donald, and say thank you.
Very good, thank you. Just regarding some of your comments, I think food is something that always worries me. We have wars break out because people can't afford to buy food, so that's not a trivial concern, and the food prices are rising really quickly. How do you see things like these? The food price increases, as you pointed out, 34% higher than last year. How do you see this impacting the security situation inside of continents like Africa? I mean, maybe let's restrict ourselves to Africa for a moment, but there's an awful lot of food that's going to get an awful lot more expensive, and has already and will continue to, without really an ability to cover the cost of that. What do you think the political implications of that will be across Africa?
I mean, it poses a significant risk. I mean, in many African countries that are already volatile when it comes to the security situation, where countries already do not have a monopoly on the use of force, I think it poses a tremendous risk that you will see civil unrest to various levels in various places. But I think that certainly is something that we might see, and I don't necessarily, and it's, as you said, does not want to paint a dark picture, but unless there's some significant political impetus to be prepared for food shortages, we are certainly going to run into a very risky period and a very unstable period, and that holds true even for South Africa. In particular, I think, as we already have our own level of challenges this side, I think the July unrest in KZN had a huge impact. And now you also had the flooding. I think there's some serious concerns on our side as well.
Yeah.
We're closer to home.
Yeah, I've started out as an optimist regarding our continental agreement, and now I've become a little bit of a cynic. It doesn't feel like there's any intention to kind of make the agreement actually happen, rather than talk about it happening. But do you think this might create some impetus for Africa to just be a little more introspective and look at what it can do to become more sufficient as a continent. Africa has a tremendous, unusually large dependency on the rest of the world if you compare it to almost any other region. Yeah, we hardly trade with each other. So I guess my question is, do you think any of this would get people to start taking the importance of intra-Africa trade a little more seriously?
I would hope so, Donald. But I'm also somewhat skeptical, to be honest, at the risk of also sounding more pessimistic than I did maybe a year ago. I think that it's politicians, the elephant is not being eaten one bite at a time, if I may say so. It feels as though the agenda is way too ambitious. We're trying to do too many things at once. We're not focusing on smaller wins. And so that's kind of, and it's more politicking than anything else. So I do hope that with this new risk, that it is going to bring us closer. But that requires significant intervention from leadership, and that's across the board. And the question is, that's something that also there again, the jury is out. We have to wait and see how the politicians are going to position themselves.
Yep. Yeah, sure. Judy, we have some questions. I'm quickly going to run through them. So Roy has been very involved. Thank you, Roy. I'm going to pop all of your questions, if you don't mind. I'm going to just try to group some of them together. As Russia and Ukraine are the largest producers of agricultural products and oil, and is also one of the largest export markets of the above items, how will Africa cope in 2022 with the shortages and huge price increases? Roy, I am very worried about that, which I kind of just stated with Judy in the conversation part of this. I'm very worried about how Africa copes with this level of inflation. It's kind of weirdly externally introduced, and I'm not sure Africa at the best of times has great tools to deal with this in a continent which has periodic terrifying inflation numbers if one looks at Zimbabwe, for example. So now I have no idea, and I don't have a good feeling that the rest of the world are going to have the capital to step in and help in this particular occasion. So I think things could get grim. I've honestly no good answer to give to you on that. I'm going to come back to some of your other questions. I'm certainly not avoiding them, but a question to you, Judy. Please explain the source and calculation of the rising cost of debt servicing cost for developing countries, average 16% of export earnings.
Yeah, and those were projections, Roy, from UNCTAD. They had based those, because of course they don't have real figures, but they based those on projections. And I'm happy to share the link to that article with you as well, so you can look at it in more detail. Yeah.
Roy, you've posed a question which I'm just going to bundle with Roberto's, because they're both kind of, they deal with two different regions, but a similar topic. Roberto, you say you dwelled a bit on the impact of the US renewing ago, but did not speculate on what the EU might do in terms of the economic partnership agreement and trade. Any speculation? And then Roy, you've said, is SA burning its foot by being neutral and not supporting the West? Will AGOA not be beneficial for SA going forward and cause more embarrassment for SA? So Roy, to your question first, South Africa for a very long time now has taken a stance which I think is short-sighted and unfortunate, but we've definitely taken a stance that has put us at odds with the US and the EU. The EU alone is our largest trading partner. If we add the US, it truly becomes very significant indeed. And we've done quite a lot, I think, to harm these relationships unnecessarily. This is not to say that South Africa shouldn't take a firm stance in negotiations on things as a country, but I think in our interactions with these two blocs particularly have been unnecessarily aggressive at times. And I think we're we're not treating these blocks as trading partners. We're treating them in some way as dispensers of aid, almost as if we have some kind of entitlement to these markets and not viewing them as real trading partners. So I think, AGOA, I think if business doesn't do a lot in a very short amount of time, AGOA is gone. I think regarding the EPA, that's a little more difficult. I don't think the EPA comes to an end, but I think the expansion of the EPA, better quotas for our wine, for example, these sorts of things are going to be increasingly difficult to obtain. And I'm sure no one will be as impolite as to punch it straight on the nose and say this is part of the reason. But I do think our market access is going to become increasingly difficult in a market that could really make a difference to South Africa's economic growth. That is my take.
If I may come in, Donald, I recall speaking to somebody else who had actually taken it the other direction. I'm not necessarily sure I agree, but I thought it was an interesting point. He mentioned, during the Cold War period, the West and the East were wooing various countries, right? They were wooing them because it wasn't as clear cut. And he said perhaps this is an opportunity for African countries to once again be wooed by the West. So I thought it was an interesting idea, and maybe something that one needs to consider as well.
Yeah, no, noted. I'll come to some of the other questions we have in a moment. Esther, you have your hand up. You're muted. Still muted, Esther. While Esther gets her technology sorted out, another question has come in. How do you feel the current price rally on the London Metal Exchange due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict will affect the global end user market? I have no specific insight there, except to be aware of the fact that the prices have gone up. I would assume we see significantly inflated prices of the various metals. I mean, one of the things which is just nothing related to this conversation, but one of the things we've noticed is when we deal with the theft of infrastructure, which is obviously a problem that's all over the media at the moment. But two things seem to drive the theft of infrastructure. The one is the security around the infrastructure, but the other one is the value of the underlying metal that is being stolen. So all of the scrap metal is traded at a derivative price of the primary metal. And it's just interesting, when things like copper, which have shot up, become very expensive, then there's simply more theft of copper. So if nothing else, I think that will be a horrible negative impact, but it's one I suspect will occur. And our policing around this is very poor. So if you combine that with very high commodity prices, I'm assuming that would be one of the implications that comes to mind. Roy, you've got your hand up. You're muted, Roy. And Pumelelo, is there an issue with Roy, perhaps on your side, that to allow him to speak, or is all okay?
Should be able to speak. Talking has been permitted on his side. Roy, can you hear us? Are you able to unmute on your side?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Hi. Yes, thanks for the interesting discussion. What I want to say is also the problem with Indonesia. They're planning to ban exports already in this current week. Now, as you know, that palm oil is the world's most widely used vegetable oil used in the cooking process.
Yes.
Now, will this actually compound the problem because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis?
Absolutely. So we've, I've spent the last 2 weeks working at factories that produce frozen chips in Europe. And yeah, the impact is immediate and very significant as the price of both of these products shoot through the roof as availability disappears. So absolutely, and that of course will have a knock-on effect into all kinds of things that are cooked. So yeah, I think the impact of the ban out of Indonesia is very worrying. And in fact, we're going to see, I believe, we're going to see a cascading effect of these bans. And the implications, I think, are quite frightening. You know, as these bans move up, we end up with this weird dual economy. Inside the country, you have a collapse in the price. Outside of the country, the price is surging. Now, the farmers can't benefit, but they still have to cover the cost of having put their crop down. It has very worrying implications. You know, nothing good comes from trade bans. And I don't think this is an exception, although I understand the fear of the Indonesian government or the Hungarians in the case of wheat, that they're going to run out locally. But I think the implications are very worrying and are going to drive the inflation dramatically. All right, we still have a few. We have a few. Oh, and Roy, to your point, I take your point that I've oversimplified with my columns of Democrats and autocrats, but I do think there is a split arising. No matter, maybe it's not well labeled, but we are seeing some kind of split. I don't want to call it east-west because that implies some kind of geographic split, but I think it's more philosophical than it is geographic in this case. You know, countries like Japan would feel themselves far more closely aligned to the West, as would Australia and New Zealand, than they would with the East in the more traditional sense. But yeah, I do think there will be a split. I don't know how that's avoidable, to be honest. Are there any other questions? The slides will be made available at the end. No problem. Anyone else? Otherwise, we can bring this to a close.
Arnold, we have one question from Karine Kruger.
Ah, hello. Karine. Minister Patel loves nothing more than banning things. So I'm not aware at the moment of any intended ban, but I would not write off the possibility, I guess, depending how things look. We don't export huge amounts of wheat, for example. We're a net importer. But on a product like that, if our wheat supply gets dramatically cut, which it certainly will be, because the 25% or about half of our imports come out of Russia and Ukraine of wheat, then yeah, I guess wheat could see an export ban, but that's just that's wild speculation. I have no evidence that that is being considered. Anyone else?
Yes, we have one more question from Beryl.
Beryl. Yeah, Beryl. So I've thought about that actually, and I think South Africa has again set itself up poorly to take advantage of what is occurring here. If we just talk, for example, about the chicken situation. So here's the reality of the chicken industry in South Africa. we don't consume chicken in a pattern that matches most of the world. So if you go to Europe, for example, very depressingly, while I'm here, everyone's eating chicken breast. There's a significant premium on chicken breast paid in Europe. South Africans don't eat a lot of chicken breast. In fact, we eat so little chicken breast that we sell the breast at the same price as all of the other pieces. So 70% of all of our chicken sold in South Africa is sold in a 2 kilogram IQF bag. Those are those pre-frozen portions where each piece is individually frozen. The most common form of that sale is 2 kilogram mixed pack. All of that kind of 8 pieces of chicken, each of the major cuts in a bag, all sold at the same price. We did a study on this to look at the export potential of chicken. So if we just did one thing, and this is based on 2016 data, if I look at the price of chicken breast in Europe at the moment, these margins would be even bigger. But at the factory gate, we would earn 35% more for our chicken breast if we could export it to Europe. And we don't. So, and we are not going to be exporting to Europe anytime soon. But this has been a problem that's been going on for 5 years, with South Africa having done very little to get our factories approved for Europe. Now, perhaps we would have had a hard time of it because we're competing there with Brazil and Ukraine. And my 35%, by the way, assumes that we would have to undercut them to get into the market. The price of chicken breasts in Europe just a week or two ago was €6 per kilogram, which is astonishing. Even by European standards, that is an unbelievably high amount of money to be paid on a cut like that. But because we haven't put the work in over the last 5 years, I say 5 years, 6 years, we haven't done the work for the last 6 years since the process started. That opportunity disappears. On some other products, certainly on some of the other grains where we are very competitive, like corn, perhaps we could grow our market share. But South Africa tends to, outside of certain basic products, tends to not think of ourselves as an exporting nation. And I think that's what makes this difficult. You know, what are the main things we export? Minerals, but those are sold as commodities at a global price. Cars, which we export, and we put about 35 billion or thereabouts into subsidies for the automotive sector, and some basic agricultural products. And then for the rest of it, we don't do a whole lot. And so, yes, I do think we could benefit. I think it's worth looking at the products that these countries trade and have a look at which of those we could trade competitively. But that also requires a desire from the producers locally to want to export. And I think if we come back to chicken, there hasn't been terribly much appetite to look at the export markets, and consequently, we have not positioned ourselves well. But I think those opportunities are still there. I'm not sure how much of that market Ukraine will retake. I don't know how long it will take for them to get back on their feet. But there is a gap. The prices are very high. It is unfortunate that we're unable to take advantage of it.
Yeah, Donald, if I may also just add to that, I think the important point you made earlier about, our minerals that we export. South Africa is, next to Russia, the second largest exporter of producer of palladium. So in the short term, we certainly do stand to benefit from that, for example. Similarly, the gold prices of gold as well. So I think those short-term sanctions on Russia, that's the first positive impact I think we can also highlight.
Yeah, to the question that Sean had asked, what advice would you give to the average consumer? Sure, don't drive too much because your fuel's going to get high. And this is a good time to go on a diet because food is going to be increasing in price. But yeah, I mean, I'm struggling to find the good news in what has happened here. It just feels like a terrible thing with a few bright spots in between. I take Judy, I agree with you on the platinum group metals, the gold. There are other minerals that we do compete with Russia on, and we have an opportunity to step in. But it's not a huge amount, I don't think.
Yeah, agreed.
Do you want to take Roy's question? Do you think Putin should realize this mistake and end the war and avoid further embarrassment as this war is ruining Russia economically?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Roy, I would probably say in an ideal world, yes, but looking at Putin's reaction, Putin's behavior and his stance on particular issues in the past, it is highly unlikely that he would. There's absolutely no sign that Putin would back down. It goes against everything that he has, every positioning he has taken on issues in the past. And for him, this is a sort of it's a turn back to the great Russia, right? I mean, it's something that is not something that I see him backing down on. And I don't know if there's enough pressure from the outside to be able to push for that. The global south, so to say, certainly is remaining very neutral.
Yeah, agreed. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining. We will be sending out a copy of the presentation to everyone. We will also make available the video. The video will go up around Monday. It takes a little bit of while for it to go through the studio and be edited. But around Monday, we'll have the video up and we'll have the presentation out within the next day. Thank you, everyone, for joining.